Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Greenberg, and I am the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited about our guest. Today we have with us Gilles Kepel, a leading scholar of the Middle East, of radical Islam, and of jihadism in Europe. Gilles Kepel wears several academic hats these days. He is professor at École Normale Supérieure, he is professor at Sciences Po, and he is professor at the University of Italian Switzerland in Lugano. He has, by my count, written over 12 books, and he is here today to discuss with us his newest book, just published in English, Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West, which I'm going to show you so you can see it. And it is a wonderful read, I just want to ask, and we're going to have a discussion about it today. Please note that this is being recorded, it is on the record, and there will be plenty of time for your questions. The book, Away from Chaos, Gilles, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here, except I actually kind of wish I were in Paris, but whatever, we'll deal with this.
Well, you're welcome anytime.
It's so nice. It's so nice to see you again, and you're well, despite everything that's going on in the world.
Well, I've been trying to keep up trucking, as they say in the States, so I'm still around.
Good. I wanted to start this discussion. I want to get right into it because there's so much to talk about. You cover 40 years of the history of the Middle East and basically the Middle East in turmoil. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the translation, because it's called Away from Chaos. And actually, I don't think the English quite conveys what you mean by away from chaos. And I just sort of wanted you to reflect on that. Did you mean apart from chaos? Did you mean escape from chaos? Did you mean remedy from chaos? How would you describe what you meant by your title?
Well, thinking that, if we look back on those 40 years, which were in a way my life with the Middle East, because, this is when I started 40 years ago. And, well, it's not been going that well over those last 40 years. I saw the worsening of jihadist movements, decade after decade. Then there was all those hopes that were called, quote unquote, the Arab Springs, that largely failed. And now we had the virus together with the collapse in the oil prices. So one of the things which I wanted to see was to sort of identify what was this chaos, what were the roots of this chaos, why it started, how it developed, and with a sort of rational analysis of the phenomenon, try to see if there were ways out of it. So the away thing is sort of, in French, it's sortir du chaos. It means going out of chaos. This is what the original meant. But, away is okay, because the book was written, of course, before the COVID-19 pandemics, but much to my regrets, it does sort of fit into it.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in a little while. I want to take us through the book so that start with the first stage of jihad that you talk about. You talk about different stages of jihad. And I just thought it'd be interesting for our audience for you to reflect on your bundling of Egypt, Bosnia, and Algeria, and seeing them sort of as the beginning of where you want to tell your story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, actually, with pleasure. Actually, the book starts a little before 1979, when, in Christmas Day, 1979, the Soviet army invades Afghanistan. And as a reaction, Brzezinski and under Carter launched, to some extent, the first counterinsurgency phenomenon, which will turn into jihad in Afghanistan. But 1979 is only a follow-up to 1973, where the book begins, which is the so-called Yom Kippur or Ramadan War of October 73, because it coincided with the two holy periods of both the Arab and the Jewish calendar. And this is when the Israeli army was stopped in its counteroffensive into Egypt, into Cairo, after the coalition of Arab oil exporting countries under the aegis of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, decided to embargo oil exports to Western countries that supported Israel. And this led to, a tremendous rise in the oil prices that skyrocketed. And it's made the oil kingdoms, the kings of oil, as we say now in colloquial. And they were the ones who would call the shots in the Middle East. And oil was the key to the relation, a new relation between the Middle East and the rest of the world. And it's made of the Middle East a central actor in the world system, which it was not before. In order for the oil kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula to use oil and to have political legitimacy, they helped the spread of Salafism or Wahhabism, a very sort of strict Islamic ideology, Islamist ideology, which was not at all revolutionary in their view. It was something that would help the masses of the Muslim world adhere to the credo of this religion, and also it would boost the pretense of the Saudis and all the others against their rivals, i.e. the Arab nationalists, Nasser, the Baathists of the time, and so on and so forth. And, they were sort of the major players in the second half of the 1970s. But then suddenly the Iranian Revolution took place. Khomeini came back from Paris, in 1979. And this was the year when there was the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt under the auspices of President Carter. Then there was the hostage crisis in the American embassy, which, Donald Trump reminded us recently, and the siege of Mecca by jihadists that came out of the Wahhabi creed, but who had turned revolutionary and who had pushed this ideology to its limits and turned it against the Saudi kingdom. And then finally, at the end of this year, as a Christmas gift to the West, the Red Army invaded Afghanistan. So this was the sort of the first stage of this drama, if you wish. And then on, 1979 made the US believe that, and there is a quotation from Zbigniew Brzezinski in the book that says, when the Red Army crossed that threshold, I called President Carter and said, it's done, And then many years later, people would ask him, but didn't you open, the box? And the genius got out of the box. And because he was born a Polish squire, he would say, what is more important, the end of communism or a few excited guys who don't count, those jihadists? There is no global Islam, he said. And so there was this alliance between the US, between the CIA and those people from all of political Islam and Wahhabists at the time, Muslim Brothers, Saudis, Qataris were all together. There were two birds to kill with one stone. One was the Soviet Union, and 10 years after the Soviets had to leave Kabul on the 15th of February, and a few months later, the Berlin Wall fell because suddenly the Soviet Union had been exposed as a paper tiger. But the other bird was Iran. And the Saudis and the Sunni kingdoms expected from that, jihad that defeated an enemy of Islam on Muslim territory to regain credibility, as opposed to the Iranian revolution. So this was the first setting of the story. And the funny thing was that, when I asked my students, when did the Soviets pull out from Kabul? No one knows. They look at their shoes. They're frightened that I say you, and they would get a bad grade. And I said, okay, it's understandable because you remember what happened the day before. And so they look at me, sort of say, maybe the old professor is sort of crazy. And then I tell them what was this day. They say it was 14th of February. And then the student says, sir, it was Valentine's Day. I say, yes, it's a good answer. It's not the right answer. It was the day of the fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini against Salman Rushdie. And why was the fatwa on that day? Because it hijacked the attention of the world, the media attention. And no one noticed that the day after was to be the victory of the Sunnis, right? And to some extent, the Sunni jihadists and the CIA were robbed of their military victory by the capacity of the Shia establishment, of the Islamic Republic of Iran establishment, to sort of capture the media scene. And this is when we had phase 2 afterwards, when those jihadists that had been coveted by the US turned against them. With the World Trade Center attack in 93, which was the divorce papers, if you want, of the former love affair between the CIA and the jihadists. Then after the US, the next target, after the USSR, sorry, the next target was the US. And when you think in jihadist terms, to them it's very clear because, you know, they sort of mimic the epics of the prophets and the early Muslims. What did they do? First, they attacked the Sassanid Empire, which was the Soviet Union. And then it took much longer, of course, they turned against Byzantium. Now, in postmodern days, the time has shrinked. And, you know, after they destroyed the Sassanid Empire of today, which is the Soviet Union, they would destroy the Byzantium of today, which was America. And that was sort of epitomized after the coal attack, after the attacks on the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the coal attack, the USS Cole in Aden, by 9/11, of course. And this is the second phase of the second age of jihadism. And it's something that is focused against the faraway enemy and not the local enemy. It was, you know, put into a book by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the chief ideologue at the time. But with that, you know, they hoped that they would win. They would destroy the whole world. But they did not succeed because this was a top-down phenomenon. Like, you know, 9/11, you had Saudis and a few others in planes that destroyed the Twin Towers, then went into Washington, one of them at least, and the Pentagon. And but you know, they had no grassroots. No one in America was interested. I mean, these were people that were flying high, if I may say so, flown in the air. And then you had this third phase, which more or less ended with ISIS, where you had another view, and you had two ideologues, the two Abu Musab al-Suri, who was educated in France as an engineer. So, you know, the French are still able to educate well leaders. And also Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian, who was more influenced by the insurgents of Mecca from 1979, actually. And the two ideologies merged informally in sort of bottom-up jihad, i.e., you don't send people in planes, you don't pay for driving lessons. But
Gilles, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. You, because I think I want to make the sound a little better here, and which is that could you, you signed on to Zoom twice. Could you sign out on one of them or not? If it's hard, don't do it. But if you see two windows open, can you close one?
I can
not, don't worry about it.
Close mine if you want. That's it.
No, don't close yours. Don't close yours. I just thought if you saw two. Okay, we're fine. Keep going. Okay, remember where you were?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
We were at the phase 3, which was bottom-up jihadism. And so they decided that the issue was not to destroy America because it was okay, it was the faraway enemy. It was too far away, really. And there was a sort of middle stage thing, which was Europe, where millions of young Muslims who were disenfranchised in our banlieues and so in disenfranchised suburbs would stay. Salafism had already been very present there. And so, you know, it was not difficult to turn them into jihad. So he thought. And so they would just, you know, take a boat or a plane or a car, go to Turkey, and from them to Syria and Iraq. And also simultaneously, in the Middle East, there had been a change whereas Shiites became the main enemy of jihadists, of Sunni jihadists, instead of what was Israel and even the West. And Zarqawi says, you know, it's better to keep 9 bullets for a Shia and 1 for an American, because the American is going to go back to Ohio or wherever one day, whereas the Shias are going to remain. And so this led to the huge ISIS or Daesh, as we say in French, phenomenon, or in Arabic, and then that led to the defeat. But how could ISIS happen? It also could happen because of the so-called Arab Springs. Not that the Arab Spring were harbingers of ISIS at all. I mean, you know, the revolts were a sort of modern, postmodern ideologies. It was the 2.0 revolution and what have you, but it led to the destruction or the toppling of a number of authoritarian regimes. So far, so good. But it created an enormous vacuum into which the jihadists made roadways. Syria, Libya, Yemen, and others. And Tunisia was probably the only example of a country where a democratic system is still functioning with all its difficulties. But in the other cases, you either had a return of a strong hand authoritarianism or the chaos anew, Libya, Syria, Yemen, in different shapes. And so the big issue is, after the book has sort of tried to rationalize all that historically, put a number of things into perspective, to try to wonder what are the stakes now. And,
okay, so let's wait on now and just go over. I was going to sort of walk listeners through everything you just said, but you did such a wonderful job. But there's a few pieces of it that I want to pull out, and then we could talk about the third part, if you like,
okay.
of the book. And then I have some questions even beyond that. So we'll see. And so there's a couple of things I just want to frame for listeners. One is the role of Russia throughout. You talk about Russia not just in terms of the war, but sort of the role that Russia has been exercising in the region. So that's one thing I'd like to begin with. Can you just talk a little bit about how you see Russia as an actor over this period of time?
Definitely. And there's a sense of revenge, if you want, for the Russians, because this whole story is about how the USSR was destroyed. And it was destroyed, of course, because of the arms race and whatever. But the final blow was Afghanistan. It was Kabul. And as I mentioned, Kabul, Soviet pullout, February 15, 1989. And then you had 11/9, which is when the Berlin Wall falls. And 11/9, for jihadists who are sort of apocalyptic thinkers, it's sort of the step before 9/11 to some extent. 11/9 is against the Soviet Empire, 9/11, the Byzantium of today, America. And then Syria nowadays has become the place where Russia, Putin's Russia, has used its might, has used its rather good tactics because it's more difficult for them to have a strategy, because Russia is not the superpower it was when we had the USSR, USA confrontation. But nevertheless, they are able to use soldiers who cost much less than American soldiers or European soldiers. They are able to use proxies, and to some extent, the Levant today is the revenge of Russia. Because this is Putin's management of the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria. It's very shrewd capacity to have excellent scholarship. And in the book, in a way, I pay tribute to a number of my Russian colleagues. Not that I necessarily praise the fact that they advise the Russian regime, but at least this is a country where scholars are listened to. And I remember I mentioned in the book of visiting the late Primakov in Russia in 2014 before his demise. He had been prime minister, he was KGB chief, but he was also the chief Orientalist. He was trained as an Arabist. And he just explained to me exactly what their strategy on Syria was at the time. And that was quite impressive because, due to the capacity of the Russian regime to use whatever sound analysis was made by their experts, they managed to devise a policy that I do not necessarily approve of, but that was efficient. And in the Syrian case, I think the West was was incapable, just stumbled because of the divide between political makers and people in the know.
Which brings me to one of the other threads that goes through the book is the challenge of democratization. And you make a point early on that the United States cared, you say, less about getting bin Laden than about a bigger agenda in the Middle East. You might want to talk a little bit about that, but also talk about the general, how you see this urge to democratize. And one of the things that you mention in talking about the urge to democratize, and you just sort of slip it in there, but it really is something I'd like to underscore, is for the United States in particular, but not only, is the way in which what happened in Eastern Europe and the democratization of places in Eastern Europe how affected the mindset of thinking about democratization. I'd just like you to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, I'll go the other way. I'll start with the end. Well, this was largely due to the fact that neocons were in charge at the time. And even though there's some of them, and I think of some of my friends, even though I don't share their ideology about the neocons, are perfect Arab speakers, Farsi speakers, know the region very well. Nevertheless, what prevails was the Berlin Wall model. And, this belief that you could just duplicate what had happened in Prague, Warsaw, or Budapest in Baghdad or Damascus or whatever. And when you had this American tank pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein on Paradise Square in Baghdad, it sort of evoked memories of people pulling down statues of Lenin or wherever in former Eastern and Central Europe. Mm-hmm. But it was not like that. This was not the same story. It was not the same cultural history, the same politics. And, at the time, if you remember, there was this debate between the Fukuyama and the Huntington school. And the Fukuyamites would say, well, the world is going to be entirely American, and there's going to be a Democratic Party and a Republican Party in every country. I mean, it's sort of hardly a caricature. And then the Huntington guy said, no, because, there are things, there are civilizations which were essentialized. So the neocons were divided between the two. I mean, they went from Huntington to Fukuyama. They hoped to treat the Huntington disease with the Fukuyama medicine. But it did not really work out because I think also what was fraught was that they had a sort of fantasy about the Shias in general. I remember one day visiting the Pentagon, and the undersecretary to Donald Rumsfeld, his name escapes me, very famous, with the guy with the thick hair and the thinker. What is his name? Yeah, you know, it's someone will tell us. And I visited him, and he. I was in the waiting room and in the Pentagon, which was just still full of the scars of the 9/11, and I was stopped everywhere by crow's crop guys who spoke American with a Midwest accent, and suddenly I was in a waiting room with people who spoke Arabic with a Middle Eastern accent, and they were all dressed in Shia garbs and cloaks, and Paul Wolfowitz, this is the name. And then I was introduced to Paul Wolfowitz, and I said, well, I'm amazed, and he insisted that, to him, Shias, in a way, were like Jews, i.e., they had been persecuted all their history. They relied on a book. The imams were to some extent the rabbis, and this was something which was, it was interesting. It was an interesting comparison, but it was not functional because the dynamics were different. And this was sold into the Beltway by all those emigrated Iraqi Shias who had come to the late Ahmed Chalabi and a few others. And this is going back to my point about Russia. In Moscow, that would not have worked because they knew better to some extent. They had better networks. Most people knew the languages, had been there a long time, and so had we to some extent in Europe. But our politicians now tend to dovetail America more than anything else. There was a first question, which was before that. You had a first
before
question.
about
before democratization. No, there was something before.
I don't know, but let's move on because I have a bunch of questions and I want to make sure we get them in. One of the things you mentioned in your opening remarks was about the price of oil. Very much in the headlines today for obvious reasons because of what's happening in the wake of the COVID crisis. But I think this is one of the more interesting threads in the book is how the price of oil from the very beginning of the story, the way you want to tell it, has been so impactful. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where you see it being the most impactful, because in the course of time you tell, and then a little bit about where we are today, because if you follow your narrative about the incredibly consequential and sometimes underestimated impact of the price of oil, it doesn't bode well for where we stand today in terms of getting away from chaos. So just a little bit on that.
Not necessarily, because the reason.
Right, I meant it as a question. Does it bode well or ill? Yes, go ahead.
Well, we'll see. I don't know. I'm no prophet, and no one is a prophet in his own country. And if you believe that the skyrocketing price of oil led to the spreading of the rentier economy in the region, and this rentier economy had its legitimacy in a very strict religion, okay, which then petered out into jihadism, which was not what the Saudis wanted originally, because it turned against them, against their kingdom, even though some rich people there thought they should subsidize them like they did during the Syria war, because, they saw Assad as a stooge for the Iranians, and whatever could hurt their enemy was good for them, and so on and so forth. But rentier economy is a catastrophe for the democratization process and for everything. And in Arabic, there is a saying says that the Arabs had two revelations. One came from God, is from the heavens, Islam, and it was so great. And the other came from under the ground, from Satan, Iblis, Shaitan, and this was oil, and it sort of fucked up the whole system, destroyed the economy, led to, it's not Dutch disease, it's whatever, Saudi disease or whatever. And if you look at what is happening now in the Arabian Peninsula, this has been rather well perceived even by the rulers, be it MBZ or MBS or whatever you may think about them or like them or not. Nevertheless, they have started to think the post-oil system. What does that mean? And if we add that, merge it with the COVID-19 thing, the issue that, people now discovered wherever that, in France, for instance, and many other European countries, we were short of masks because we had outsourced everything in China. And then we were blackmailed by the Chinese. And so if you have this sort of, I think you say reshoring in America, relocalizing things, not necessarily in Oregon or in the heart of France, but in North Africa. The wages in Morocco now are lower than the wages in China. And, the country has been able to produce, export, airplanes parts, semiconductors, and a number of things. And, the supply chain can also, for Europe, at least because it's so close, be relocated to some extent in the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, maybe tomorrow the Levant, which has a middle class, which was destroyed by a regime, and the Russians can't deliver Syria alone because they are broke. And, they played this game, trying to chase Midwest American shale oil producers out of the market. So they're out of the market. America is going to be a net importer of oil today, but the American economy is much more diversified than relying on oil only. Whereas for Russia now, they're hard hit. It was the sort of the sorcerer's apprentice game they play with. And therefore, the fact that oil stops to be this, unique commodity. Plus, there is also the pressure about climate change, except in the White House for the time being. But I believe that this could make the Middle East a more sort of normal region. There are many variables in this scenario, and but why not? Because the Arab Springs, in a way, have been a betrayed revolution to a large extent, because the rentier machine came back and erased much of the benefits. But now we have a different situation.
Well, can I just ask you, interrupt there for a second and just ask you, we have a bunch of questions coming in. One from Judy Miller, who says hi, by the way. And it's kind of along these lines of what you're talking about, which is, it's one thing to talk about how democratization efforts failed. It's another thing to ask the question, do you believe that Islamic, as Judy does, do you believe that Islamic societies can democratize? It's a loaded question, but
well,
a good one.
I can, even if I'm not able to deal with it entirely or essentially.
Another book.
Go back to what I just said, i.e., with much less importance to the oil rent, more to entrepreneurial issues, the building of an entrepreneurial class and of a labor force. This leads, paves the way for democratization. Take an example which now has not turned that well, Turkey. Turkey,
Yeah.
10 years ago, was praised everywhere, particularly under Obama and during the Obama administration, because this was a country that's devoid of oil. And then you had a democratic system with governments that would change. And, you know, this led to a boosting economy until Mr. Erdogan went nuts with it and now has made himself the enemy of everybody, including many in his own country. But, you know, the process could be achieved to some extent. And therefore, this is, I believe, the ground for the democratization of societies that happen to be Muslim. And in terms of whether Islam in itself harbors the germs of democratization or of, on the contrary, of authoritarianism, well, everybody lies in the capacity to provide the interpretation of the text. And when you have oil, when, you know, in old days Saudi Arabia and in Iran, the grand ulama were the best paid people because they provided legitimacy. And in order to have this legitimacy, they interpreted the text in the most rigid way. Just an example of today. In Saudi Arabia, the fact that visas were suspended for Umrah, for the small pilgrimage, that there was a very strict lockdown, gatherings at Friday prayers were not allowed, and Eid al-Fitr, which ends the holy month of Ramadan, which is going to happen in a few days, is not allowed to take place in congregation, was something that showed that the Saudi political establishment is not that much in need of legitimacy by the Grand Ulama. Whereas, on the contrary, in Iran, you know, the legitimacy of the supreme leader is so much under the control of the religious establishment of which he is a member, that he would not take measures against people attending, you know, worshipping of saints' tombs, kissing and licking saints, which was the magic recipe for this unbelievable spread of coronavirus. But then you know, among the jihadists and the arch Salafists today, they say, no, the virus was something that was sent by God to punish the unbelievers. China, that persecutes Uyghurs, the American and the French, whose aircraft carriers were badly hit because they hit Muslims in Syria, meaning jihadists, and also the heretics Shias, who were hit particularly. So this was a sign that, you know, well, fortunately, not too many people believe those things, but if you judge by the social networks, it's everywhere.
We are flooded with questions. Jim Hoyos, any evidence that low Saudi oil prices will change the support for non-state actors? And just so you know, I'm going to follow up with a couple questions about terrorism, ISIS, and a few other things. But any evidence that low Saudi oil prices will change the support for non-state actors?
By non-state actors, you mean jihadists, or?
I'm assuming that that's what they mean. And I think it's partly a reflection on, you know, there is some commentary about the new Saudi regime, you know, not supporting of non-state actors and others who say they do, and just kind of, you can walk us through that in your own, from your own perspective.
Well, my understanding, and I have discussed those issues with some of the Saudi leaders actually, is that they are nowadays more embarrassed by those non-state actors and jihadists because they are also their targets. And within the Saudi establishment, opponents to the crown prince would rely on the jihadists. So he had made it quite obvious in an interview that he gave to Jimmy Goldberg from the Atlantic when he visited the States. And I mean, this is something which I personally, which I believe, and I've seen some evidence of that. You know, there's another thing also that when oil prices were high and Iran had oil and Saudi had oil and everything, so competition was for who would be the hegemon in terms of the political language of Islam. So you had the Saudis who control the thing, and then the Iranians in 79 and after tried to outflank them and be more radical and so on and so forth. Nowadays, with oil prices coming down, my assumption is that the Islamic legitimation or the legitimacy of the regimes is not as needed. If you have an entrepreneurial society that comes up, also in case globalization changes because dependence of China is not affordable anymore, either for political reasons and also because of climate issues. Therefore, I mean, you would have a Levant and a North Africa that would be in a much closer relation with the European environment. And that will, I believe, will change the cards.
So just to tag on to that a little bit, just uh, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on ISIS today and where you see the future of ISIS, if you see a future for ISIS, and just sort of the shape of jihadi terrorism globally, not just in Europe, not just in the Middle East, not just how do you see it? Where are we now with the destruction of the Caliphate?
Well, I have a personal story with ISIS, you know, because they sentenced me to death 3 times,
I
and I'm
remember
still
this.
around, and they are not in good shape. All the ones who passed the sentence are now a few feet under the earth or under the ground. So I believe that they were destroyed militarily by both the bombings of a coalition, by police and security measures, particularly in Europe and in my country, because, you know, we were the biggest net exporter of ISIS jihadists to the Middle East and France. And also because they were defeated on the ground in Syria, mainly thanks to the Kurds, who were not thanked that much by the West, as you know, afterwards, and in Iraq, largely by the Shia, who had been their targets. As of now, I believe that the ISIS model, and which in the book I describe as the sort of the end game of the third phase of jihadism, this sort of bottom-up Abu Mus'abain, or the two Abu Mus'ab jihad. This model has not worked. So what my students who follow the social networks, I'm too old to do something like that now, and even to be able to use the computers as I should, what they tell me is that there is, you know, there's a lot of disarray in their ranks, and that even though many of the sympathizers believe that the ideology is still right, is still okay, nevertheless, the method was wrong. And also, you know, the horrendous killing of infidels, apostates, kuffar, and what have you, actually backlashed against them. And this does not work out. And our jails here are filled with unrepentant jihadists. They still want to destroy the West, France, whatever, all bad Muslims, but they know that the methods that was used by ISIS did not work out, and they are victims. And this is something to which we have to pay attention, because, you know, the prisons and the jails and everything are the harbinger for those movements. And Sayyid Qutb, actually, ideology was born out of Nasser's prison. And one of my students, Hugo Micheron, who's going to be at Princeton for a postdoc this year at Princeton University, wrote a book which was a great success in French, on French jihadism. He interviewed more than 100 jihadi convicts or prisoners in French jails, and what he has to say about their ideology is absolutely staggering.
We have a question about Iran from Francois Valentin. Do you think we could see a realignment between the US and Iran in our lifetime, or have too many bridges been burnt? Would it have to take the shape of a regime change in Iran, or hopefully, or some other way forward? What do you think?
Well, you know better, Karen, about what America thinks about Iran, and there's always.
Luckily, he didn't ask me, though. It's because your name on the top. Go ahead.
Well, you'd better for the time being. In DC, but you're New York based, so you're innocent. In DC, they always tend to believe that the regime is on its last legs and everything. Well, I have to say that those last months, things did not bode very well for Iran. The sanctions, the GCPOA, whether you think it was a good or a bad thing, were to some extent politically efficient because they isolated the Iranian regime, and they led them also to plunder Iraq for money, which in turn led to the revolt of Shias in southern Iraq. I mean, the consulates, the Iranian consulates in the holy cities in Iraq were attacked, just like the American embassy in Tehran way back. And so Iran cannot really count on the empire it has built. There are a number of very beautiful maps in the book. They were drawn
like the one behind you. There's a beautiful map behind you.
This is an old map from when I was a student or a pupil. This was the map of the Roman Empire, and I guess this was why I decided.
I've been wondering what on earth. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, if you have a look at this, you can see Egypt here, and I think, this is here, whatever, but see it the other way around. And the maps were drawn by Fabrice Balanche, who was a great scholar who spent some time at the Washington Institute. He's now back in France, an excellent geographer of the Middle East. And so in the last map of the book, the last flap, you see the Middle East today. The first one was the Middle East in '73, where the Israeli-Arab conflict was the key divide, right? And the Russian and the USSR, USA. Nowadays, you have this huge Iranian quote-unquote crescent, which is in yellow on the map, which goes from Tehran to southern Beirut. And the Sunni bloc, which is divided into pro-Muslim brothers, i.e. Turkey and Qatar, anti-Muslim brothers, i.e. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, and others, and the divide which cuts Libya in two with Haftar backed by the anti-Muslim brothers and Tripoli and Sarraj backed by the others. And this is starting to change because I believe that the Tehran's grip on its regional empire is now much more difficult also to sell to the population because, as far as I know, they are bringing back their people from Syria because it's too costly. And and the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, or the vaporization, as they say, was to whom I devote a number of pages in the book because I believe he was still alive when I wrote it, and the book ends, actually, the American edition ends with his assassination or termination or execution, whatever you want, you name it, in January 2020. So because the book was updated, it took so long to publish the book in English that then the good thing is that it was updated, and it showed also a lot of hubris in the part of the Iranians. And this is what I quote in the book, Pompeo, I believe in July 2018, making this statement. Was it at the American Enterprise Institute or another such right-wing institution, saying, you know, to prepare for against about GCPOA, that you know, Qasem Soleimani used house money, you know, your House of Representatives, in order to blood money, right? And this was a very clear targeting of the guy. But you know, they were so confident that you know, they have there's 5,000 years of civilization behind them in Iran, that they didn't pay attention. And you know, he was terminated with the chief of one of the most important pro-Iranian militias, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, in Baghdad airport, not even in Iranian territory. So this mistake and a few others make me believe that the Iranian regime is weak. And you know, the French worked a lot. Macron worked a lot to reintroduce them. He invited Rouhani and Javad Zarif to the Biarritz G7 last year and everything. What did we get? We got two of our fellow colleagues, one French-Iranian lady, Fariba Adelkha, and her companion, Roland Marchal, who spent months in Evin. He's been freed in exchange for an Iranian engineer who was shopping for nuclear material in Europe, but she's still in jail and in horrendous conditions. And you know, they've been playing like that in the past, but I believe that those days are reaching their end, and that they cannot antagonize everyone at the same time. And when oil prices are low, you're not in a position to deal with that.
Let me get to another question here from James Fitzsimmons. Do you see Albania and Kosovo's democracies being vulnerable to third stage jihadism because of foreign fighters returning?
Well, even though I come from Eastern Europe on my father's side, I think this is a little outside my area of expertise. I mean, I've never set foot on Albania, neither in Kosovo, and I tend to talk only about what I know a little. But there have been jihadist groups in both places. They have not really managed to survive significantly in terms of political terms the defeat of ISIS. But I should advise our listener that he turns to people who are more competent than I am on that matter.
Okay, I want to ask a little bit about COVID and how the virus has affected the terrorist groups, how they're thinking about it, how they're responding to it, and where you think all this is headed.
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, in sort of some of jihadist discourse, COVID is perceived as the will of Allah. And that's even among some Salafists who consider that, you know, for instance, the sermons, normally you should not congregate in mosques during COVID because of social distanciation, but Salafists, many of them have clandestine prayers in apartments or garage or what have you. And what I heard, or what was told to me, was that, you know, what they say is that it's useless to look for medication, dawah, as they say in Arabic. It's only God that decides. So if you fast during Ramadan, if you do your prayers in times, if your religion is exacerbated, then you will not be touched by COVID. And if you are, you'll go to paradise if you're a good Muslim. And you know, the fact that, as I mentioned, Western countries were hard hit, China was hard hit, heretic Iran was hard hit, was the proof of that in this sort of conspiracy theory, jihadism. Well, apart from that, as of now, the Arab world has not been hard hit the way people expected. Is it because the population is much younger than the European population, or to some extent the American population? Or is it, and there are also less exchanges? I mean, when you look at the map, for instance, in the US, where the COVID-19 has hit harder from the beginning, it was on, the blue parts of the map where the Democrats are elected, both coast, Great Lakes, and some, not because it was under democratic jurisdiction, as some would say in the White House, but because these were the most vibrant places in the US, where you had a lot of air traffic at airports and everything. And the same was true. The most hard-hit places in Europe were also the Rhine Valley, Britain, France, Spain, Italy. And in the Middle East, there are less interactions in terms of exchanges and everything. So that might be one thing. The other question, and I'm no expert, I'm the only non-expert on COVID that appears on any screen today. Maybe the peak has not been reached yet. And like people in Russia and in Eastern Europe say, no, we're devoid of COVID. Well, it's now skyrocketing in Russia, same in Brazil. And so I think, as little I understood after two months of lockdown, is that we have to wait and see. So whether or not it will have a huge death toll, we don't know. But the other thing will be that probably because of the disorganization of the world economy, that hits much harder poor societies. The number of people who would die of hunger, who would not find a job, and et cetera, and so on and so forth, because of the COVID consequences. The second wave, which is not sanitary, which is social and economic, is gonna be extremely important. And when we discussed the oil rent model, was it, on the long term, we could say, well, it's great, it's going to turn into entrepreneurial countries, which will lead to democratization and what have you. But in the meanwhile, this may, in the long term, things may look nice, but in the meanwhile, without oil money, number of places that are heavily dependent on remittances. Also, a big issue for the Middle East is the fact that, Dubai model relied on the fact that Dubai was a hub between Europe, the West, on the one hand, Asia on the other hand. This sort of Venice type, modern Venice economy, if you want, at a globalized level, probably is going to be hard hit by the whole system. So there are a number of sources of income, of hegemon, which are going to be shattered by the concomitance of the collapse in the oil prices, which started a little before, but was amplified tremendously by COVID-19 and the pandemics itself. So as of, the near future, it's going to be very difficult, no doubt. But as is always the case, the ones who think forward will get out much better.
Well, given that we're out of time, I have one last question for you. But your book there are two things that your book talks about. One is chaos is not a good idea. And yet you've just outlined a scenario where a lot of destabilization, a lot of unknowns, a lot of insecurity is definitely gonna affect the short term, if not the long term. And
Yes,
you've also
I've also mentioned that there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. We end our shows, just like our events, always with signs of hope. So if you could tell us, in what you've written and in thinking about it. And here I'd like you to just reflect a little bit. I don't usually direct these, but one of the things that you focus on in your book is the way in which thinkers and far-seeing diplomats and others, there are some who have been able to figure out a more peaceful way of going about things in the world and a more constructive way. And so I want to, when you're thinking about hopefulness, do you see hopefulness in terms of leadership anywhere? And I hate to put, the topic in your mouth so you can avoid it, but if you do have thoughts on that, I would love to hear them.
Well, thank you. In terms of leadership, I don't know. I'm no leader myself, so I have no idea. But I believe that, the last half century in the Middle East has led to this sort of crash that we see now. And with hindsight, we had the capacity to learn lessons from the past and to go in another direction. And this collapse of the oil prices, together with COVID-19, bring the basis for this rethinking. And there was an attempt during the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Springs. It did not work out for a number of reasons. Many of them are explained in the book, so we have no time because we're already after hours. But this may be a much better time. And some people, like in Morocco, for instance, or even in the Gulf, the establishment has thought about the future. And I believe that we in the West, if that means anything, I mean, from my own vantage point, we in Europe, because we're not far away, we're close by. We have to rethink the world of today, the post-pandemics, as a world where you won't have those huge supply chains. And this may be extremely beneficial for regional developments. Because even without COVID-19, the globalized system, with everything outsourced to China, would have led to a catastrophe, not to mention why and how and where from and whence the virus emanated, in Bathaka, to say it in Arabic, which is something I have no expertise about, but like everybody, I'm really wondering.
So maybe you're right. Maybe that's the takeaway, that it forces us to rethink things, and us as a globe,
Yeah, it's
not just as the West.
Such a thing, is not that.
And maybe
Not
it's time was
unusual
coming.
when you think of what academia has become, and people, instead of thinking, just follow trends, post this, and intersectionalism or what have you. This is something for real, and if our community could deal with reality instead of passing judgments, that would be a great revolution, a great cultural revolution, definitely.
Reality as the hopeful sign. Gilles Kepel, thank you so much for joining us today. The book is Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West. And eventually this will be up online as a podcast, as well as the YouTube video on our channel. And there will be a button to buy the book. So please do. Thank you, Gilles. It was wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Karen. Farewell.
Bye.